And joining me now is Daniela Schwarzer, Executive Board Member at the Bertelsmann Stiftung. Good evening to you, ma'am.
Good evening.
So after weeks of talks, Brussels has a deal. Ukraine has funding to fight Moscow, but it's not from Russia's frozen assets and it only fills a shortfall for the next 2 years. Is this a last-minute plaster for Kyiv, or is it a real show of European strength?
I believe that it's important that countries united behind the shared goal of supporting Ukraine as the US has reduced its support for Ukraine. And Volodymyr Zelensky had said that Ukraine is facing a financing gap in early 2026. And so it is a last-minute decision to provide funding. And the agreement on this goal is important. We saw disagreement over the past 2 days, but also the weeks heading to the summit, over the question, how should this money be provided? And a number of countries, including Belgium and others, did not want to use the Russian frozen assets. From a Belgian perspective, there clearly was a risk perception which was not shared, for instance, by the German Chancellor, who was very much arguing for the use of those assets. And now the European Union is borrowing money to fund the aid to Ukraine, which I think will work perfectly well. And the important thing is that the Russian assets will be used to guarantee those loans. And also, if Russia does not pay Ukraine reparations, the assets will be used to refund the money that is now raised. So I think all in all, it was a good compromise that was found in a situation where national interests diverged over the instrument, but not so much over the goal. There was, of course, Hungary, which wanted to slow down things, but in the end did not block anything. So I think it was a difficult summit, but the result is extremely important because Ukraine will get the support it needs early next year.
The thing is, European Council President Antonio Costa told us in the early hours this morning that, quote, "We committed and we delivered." I'm interested in your view on this because they committed to releasing Russia's frozen assets, to winning Belgium over, and that did not happen. So that's not entirely true, is it?
Well, indeed, the commitment to the instrument, i.e. using Russian assets, that did not work. I think it's important to note that Belgium was not the only country that had concerns about the use of the assets. And the reasons for that lie also in the fear for financial stability, because it would have looked from the perspective of some governments as destabilizing potentially to the Eurozone, or at least to individual financial institutions. And that was really also the Belgian concern. If those assets are seized and other countries or actors could have decided to pull out money out of Europe because they feel that the situation wasn't reliable anymore. So I think now the goal is still to use the Russian assets, but there's more time to prepare how they can actually be used in a very different situation than we had in the course of this week. So I think those concerns need to be looked at, analyzed, and then the conclusions need to be drawn how, in the end, the Russian assets can be used in a way that provides an answer to those concerns, which some governments in Belgium was the most vocal, but others shared this, that this can be handled. But it's true that the initial goal of using the Russian assets now, that was not met.
Specifically on, you mentioned the two instruments at play here, the instrument of this borrowing loan. Is Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk right then that, as he puts it, it is always better to have a piece of something than all of nothing?
I totally agree. We now have at least a solution for Ukraine, and that is the most important thing to make sure that Ukraine stays in a position to defend itself. We very clearly see that Russia is in no way reducing its attacks on Ukraine. They happen at night, they happen during daytime, they hit civilians, they hit critical infrastructure. So Ukraine needs to be able to defend itself. And, pushing the country into a situation early next year where it can't fund what it needs to do anymore, that would have been a really disastrous result of the summit. So I think this solution at least fills the gap. And the question how to deal with Russian assets and how to make Russia pay for the damage it causes, this can now be dealt with more time. But of course, it remains a big question how those billions of euros of Russian money can actually be used.
What about Russia in all of this? Because German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, he says this $90 billion loan sends an unequivocal message to Moscow. But given that the intention was to release those frozen assets, that did not happen. Will Vladimir Putin really be looking at the past 24 hours in Brussels and going, OK, well, I need to be more careful. Europe and Ukraine are stronger than I thought, especially because, and I have a quote here from the Kremlin's top economic negotiator, Kirill Dmitriev, saying, look, the law and common sense have won a victory.
Well, that's, of course, a Russian interpretation, but the situation now is that the countries agreed to keep those Russian assets frozen and keep them frozen over time, so Russia does not have access to the assets. And I think that's a very clear message. Although the money is not spent at the moment, there's still no access for Russia to those assets. And the commitment in the Council conclusions is very clear. Once the loans have to be refunded, unless Russia can be pushed to pay reparations, then it will be the assets that can be used to cover the credits. And I think that is the important message that goes out today. And the Russian interpretation which you gave, to me, seems very typical from Moscow's perspective, but my interpretation here is very different.
Now, speaking of Friedrich Merz, he pushed hard against the common EU borrowing. He campaigned for this reparations loan. Of course, so did Ursula von der Leyen, saying there was no other alternative. You mentioned that rightly so, that these frozen assets are permanently frozen, and that happened in the last few days as well. But does this workaround shoot any future efforts in the foot to release those assets? Because next time there's a standoff, can leaders just say, well, common borrowing works too?
Well, you quoted the Chancellor Merz's criticism or resistance even in the beginning to going to the markets to borrow money for defense. And I think here we see a very strong continuity of a German position, which has nothing to do with Ukraine, but which has a lot to do with the idea how to fund European expenditure. And that is that Germany has never really favored, except for once during the COVID times when a big fund was created, the Next Gen EU fund. And, apart from that, it has never supported the idea to create Eurobonds or to fund European activities through extra borrowing. But it always emphasized that the money should be given by the member states and it should be used what is there. And now Germany left that position because of the sense of urgency that is in order to support Ukraine. So I think that is a very important signal.
Belgian Prime Minister Bart de Wever has talked about feeling personally intimidated by the Kremlin. We've also heard these reports of officials from the Belgian finance house, Euroclear, and other politicians being reportedly targeted by Russian intelligence. How worrying is that? And do you think the resistance in Brussels could show that intimidation works to a certain extent?
First of all, we have to be very realistic. Russia intervenes in domestic debates and domestic societies every day. And so we are in a situation of hybrid attacks. And it is no surprise that those attacks were heightened before such an important summit. You can also see that in the social media sphere, the interpretation before the summit, but also after the summit, there is clearly a high amount of disinformation and of twisting the messages and reinterpreting. Now, what the Belgian Prime Minister has said is also very worrisome because he speaks of direct threats and direct blackmailing maybe. And that's part of Russia's strategy. I think Europeans need to make this public. It's important that we discuss this in order to look at the relationship that we currently have with Russia. Because still some people wish to believe that this is a war between Russia and Ukraine. But as a matter of fact, it is a conflict which reaches into our own societies. And if a European Prime Minister says he was personally threatened, this is something to be taken very, very seriously. And of course, such an intervention does occasionally have impact. I can't measure now how much of that impact was threats and how much was the concerns about using the Russian frozen assets and create financial instability. But it is clear Russia is intervening, Russia is threatening. So we Europeans need to stand together very closely and strongly and in a very determined way to protect peace on our continent and to hold the European Union together, and most of all to support Ukraine as it defends itself.
Now, we're running out of time, but I want to end with what you hinted at earlier. What happens for the loan to be repaid, which is that Russia sends its reparations to Ukraine and then that loan is designed to be paid back through that. But do you see a world where reparations aren't sent by Russia after a peace deal and that the EU member states are the ones that end up picking up this loan bill?
Well, first of all, we need to come to a situation where there's a true peace deal. And that requires, in a first instance, to push Russia to a position where it suddenly has an interest to really negotiate. We haven't seen this now. But if the war ends, which I very much hope, the question now then is, can Russia be pushed to reparations quickly? What is the time, to get all of this negotiated and solved? And on the other hand, we have the loans which will be given to Ukraine and which are based on borrowing in the financial markets. And those timelines may not match. So it can be that the Russian assets need to be used in order to pay back the money that is now going to be raised in the markets. I think the important thing is that member states have formulated very clearly that this is a path they are investigating, and they can now do it with much more time than during this emergency summit, because the Belgians asked for some kind of stabilization guarantees in case the situation gets out of control. They asked for guarantees, and they asked for very high guarantees. I think the situation will be very different if further down the lane, using Russian assets as part of a larger negotiation situation, if governments have had time to provide for emergency stabilization and to have clarity how exactly they will be used. So I think, we are now in a very different situation looking at the question how the assets can be used.
Daniela Schwarzer, Executive Board Member at the Bertelsmann Stiftung, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
And that's all for World News tonight. Do stay with us here on TVP World for more. I'm Dahmen. Good night.